Welcome to Esoteric Guardian. Today, we're going to dive into some of the darkest corners of human spirituality and magical practice. We're talking about the most brutal, dangerous, and extreme esoteric rituals ever performed throughout history. This investigation, I must clarify, is based on historical records, occult manuscripts, and documented practices. In no way am I encouraging anyone to attempt these rituals. Our goal is purely educational, to understand what drives human beings to such extremes in their search for power, enlightenment, or contact with forces beyond our comprehension. Throughout history, humanity has crossed every imaginable line in the pursuit of transcendence. Some rituals were designed to break the practitioner psychologically. Others demanded literal bloodshed. And some, according to their practitioners, opened doors that should have remained closed forever. What you're about to hear isn't fiction. These aren't stories invented to scare children. These are real practices performed by real people with real consequences that echo through history and into our present day. Let's begin with perhaps the most infamous ritual in Western occultism. When we talk about dangerous Western occultism, one name appears repeatedly: Aleister Crowley. And among all his experiments, one stands out as perhaps the most dangerous ritual in Western magical tradition, the Abramelin operation. But before we get to Crowley's catastrophic attempt, we need to understand what this ritual actually is and why it's considered so dangerous. The sacred magic of Abramelin the Mage is a grimoire supposedly written by Abraham of Worms, a Jewish mage in the 1450s. The book describes a systematic magical operation designed to achieve what ceremonial magicians call knowledge and conversation with the holy guardian angel. Now, if you're thinking this sounds like some pleasant meditation with angels, think again. This is one of the most demanding, psychologically brutal, and potentially catastrophic rituals ever devised. The original ritual requires 18 months of complete dedication. 18 months. That's a year and a half of your life devoted entirely to this single operation. Crowley, being Crowley, modified it down to 6 months. But even this shortened version is absolutely punishing. Let me break down exactly what's required, because the devil, as they say, is in the details. First, you must find or create a completely isolated location. You need a house or apartment where you can perform the ritual undisturbed, with a dedicated oratory or temple space, and ideally with a terrace or outdoor area for certain operations. During the operation, you minimize contact with other human beings to the absolute bare minimum necessary for survival. Your daily schedule becomes completely regimented. You wake before dawn every single day. You perform ablutions, ritual washing, according to specific procedures. You dress in clean, simple clothing, ideally white linen. Then you enter your oratory and begin the first of multiple daily prayer sessions. And when I say prayers, I'm not talking about a quick Our Father and you're done. These are extended invocations, often lasting an hour or more, performed with absolute concentration and devotion. You perform these prayer sessions multiple times per day: morning, noon, evening, and before bed at minimum. Miss a session, and according to the grimoire, you risk compromising the entire operation. Your diet becomes severely restricted. You fast regularly. When you do eat, it's simple: pure foods. No meat, no alcohol, no stimulants. Some versions require vegetarianism throughout the entire period. The goal is purification. You're attempting to refine your physical vessel into something capable of sustaining contact with a being of pure spiritual light. But here's where it gets really interesting and really dangerous. The operation is structured in 2 main phases, and the first phase is all about demons. According to the magical theory of the grimoire, before you can ascend to contact your holy guardian angel, you must first confront and bind every demonic force that might interfere with that contact. You're not just acknowledging that demons exist, you're actively invoking them, calling them by name, commanding them to appear. The grimoire provides lists of demons organized by hierarchy. There are 4 principal kings: Lucifer, Leviathan, Satan, and Belial. Under these 4 are 8 sub-princes. Under them are countless servants. And the operation requires you to systematically work through this infernal hierarchy. You call these entities into your sphere of awareness. You confront them. You assert dominance through the authority of divine names and your own purified will. You bind them to obedience. You extract oaths from them that they will serve rather than hinder you. Now imagine the psychological reality of this. You're spending 6 to 18 months in isolation, fasting, praying constantly, sleeping little, and deliberately invoking everything your culture has taught you to fear. You're calling up demons, you're inviting them into your consciousness, you're engaging in psychological warfare with entities that, whether you believe they're objectively real or just aspects of your own psyche, have all the time in the world to find your weaknesses. The mental strain is enormous. Practitioners report vivid nightmares, waking visions, paranoid thoughts, and the constant feeling of being watched or followed. Some experience what they interpret as direct attacks, sudden illnesses, accidents, or disturbing synchronicities. The line between spiritual experience and psychological breakdown becomes razor thin. And then, if you successfully navigate this gauntlet of demons, if you complete the preliminary purifications, if you maintain absolute discipline for months on end, you finally attempt the climax of the operation, the invocation of your holy guardian angel. This is described as a moment of overwhelming spiritual light. The angel appears, or makes its presence known, and establishes direct communication with you. According to those who claim to have successfully completed the operation, this contact provides absolute certainty of your true spiritual nature and life purpose. It grants access to magical knowledge and power, far beyond anything available through ordinary means. The angel supposedly becomes a permanent presence in your life, a source of guidance and authority that allows you to command spirits, work magic with ease, and navigate life with perfect clarity about your true will. That's if everything goes right. But what happens when it goes wrong? Aleister Crowley attempted the Abramelin operation at Boleskine House in 1899. He had purchased this mansion specifically for this purpose. He set up his oratory. He began the preliminary prayers and purifications. He started invoking the demonic hierarchies. But Crowley, brilliant and disciplined as he was in many ways, had a fatal flaw. He couldn't maintain the isolation. His personal life kept intruding. He traveled to Paris. He dealt with various dramas with other members of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. He became involved in complicated, romantic entanglements. The operation, which demands absolute single-minded dedication, was constantly interrupted. And then, after several months, he abandoned it entirely without completing the second phase. He had opened the demonic floodgates without establishing the divine authority necessary to close them properly. According to Crowley's own later writings and the accounts of people who knew him, the consequences plagued him for years. He experienced what he called his dark night of the soul, a period of spiritual desolation and psychological torment. But the effects extended far beyond Crowley himself. Boleskine House developed a reputation as one of the most haunted locations in Britain. Subsequent owners reported violent phenomena, objects moving on their own, doors slamming, apparitions, and an oppressive atmosphere of malevolence. People who stayed in the house reported nightmares, feelings of being attacked in their sleep, and psychological disturbances that sometimes lasted long after they left. In the 1960s and 70s, Led Zeppelin guitarist Jimmy Page, who was deeply interested in Crowley and occultism, purchased Boleskine House. Even Page, who was no stranger to dark occultism, found the house disturbing. He rarely stayed there and eventually sold it. In 2015, a massive fire destroyed much of the house. Another fire in 2019 damaged what remained. Some occultists see this as the house finally purging itself of the entities Crowley unleashed. Others believe those entities simply no longer have a physical anchor in our world and are now free to roam. This grimoire itself warns about this repeatedly. It states that anyone who begins the operation frivolously, without true dedication, or who abandons it midway will suffer terribly. The demons you've invoked will remain in your sphere of influence, and without the angelic authority to command them, they will torment you. Whether the demons are objectively real entities or complexes in your unconscious mind almost doesn't matter. The effect is the same. You've damaged your psychological equilibrium in ways that may take years to repair, if they can be repaired at all. This is why serious occult teachers emphasize that grimoire magic, especially operations like Abramelin, should never be attempted without proper preparation, experienced guidance, and absolute commitment. The brutality of this ritual isn't in any physical ordeal. It's in the systematic psychological warfare you wage against yourself and the spiritual forces, however you conceive them, that you invite into your life. For almost 2,000 years, from 1500 BCE to the 4th century CE, the Eleusinian Mysteries stood as the highest and most sacred initiation of the ancient Greek world. They were dedicated to Demeter and Persephone, goddesses of life, death, and rebirth. Thousands were initiated, philosophers, emperors, poets, yet not one ever revealed what truly happened inside the Telesterion, the great hall of Eleusis. The penalty for speaking a single word of it was death. What could be so powerful that an entire civilization agreed to keep it secret for 2 millennia? Initiates began with purification and fasting, then walked 14 miles from Athens to Eleusis along the sacred way, carrying offerings and singing hymns. At the temple, they sacrificed a pig, a blood oath of devotion, bathed in the sea, and drank the kykeon, a ritual brew made of barley and mint. Modern research suggests it contained ergot, a natural source of LSD-like compounds. In other words, the priests of Eleusis had mastered an ancient psychedelic technology. By the time night fell, initiates had been fasting for days, mentally and physically broken down, perfectly prepared for transcendence. Inside the Telesterion, thousands stood in total darkness. Hours passed. Then came the visions. Ancient texts described things seen, things done, things revealed. First came terror, the feeling of death itself, of descending into the underworld. Then, at the peak of fear, blinding light filled the hall. What they saw in that moment remains unknown. Perhaps the return of Persephone, perhaps a sacred object, or maybe a vision that existed only in the mind. Whatever it was, it changed them forever. Those who survived the mysteries lost all fear of death. Cicero wrote that it taught humans not only to live with joy, but to die with better hope. To experience Eleusis was to undergo ego death, to witness consciousness beyond the body. And once you've seen that, death loses its meaning. But not everyone returned whole. Some went mad, unable to reintegrate what they had seen. The Greeks knew this. The lesser mysteries acted as psychological preparation. If you couldn't handle them, you were barred from the greater ones. When Christianity rose, the mysteries were destroyed, and with them, humanity lost a proven system for inducing mystical transformation. No torture, no physical brutality. The violence was psychological, the annihilation of the self. The Eleusinian Mysteries remind us of something essential. Real transformation demands ordeal. You cannot awaken without dying a little first. And for 2,000 years, the people of Eleusis perfected the art of dying before death. Now we descend into territory that moves beyond personal spiritual practice into something that entire civilizations participated in. We're talking about ritualized child sacrifice, specifically the worship of Moloch in ancient Canaan and Carthage. Archaeological evidence has confirmed what ancient texts described. These cultures systematically sacrificed children to their god, and they did so with ritual precision that makes it one of history's most disturbing religious practices. Moloch, also spelled Molech or Molech, was a deity worshipped in the ancient Levant, particularly by the Canaanites, Phoenicians, and their Carthaginian descendants. The name may derive from the Hebrew Melech, meaning king, combined with the vowels from Bosheth, meaning shame. The Hebrews literally renamed this god King of Shame. But to his worshippers, Moloch was the king of heaven, a god of fire and power who demanded the ultimate sacrifice, the lives of children. Before we examine the ritual itself, we need to understand the archaeological evidence, because for a long time, scholars debated whether child sacrifice to Moloch was real or anti-Semitic propaganda. The Hebrew Bible repeatedly condemns the practice. Greek and Roman historians describe it with horror. But was it actually performed, or was it accusation and myth? In 1921, archaeologists working in Carthage, the great Phoenician city in North Africa, discovered a cemetery unlike any other. Called the Tophet, after the biblical burning place in the Valley of Hinnom, this cemetery contained thousands upon thousands of urns. Inside these urns were the cremated remains of infants and young children. The initial interpretation was that this was a cemetery for children who died of natural causes. But as excavations continued and analysis became more sophisticated, that interpretation couldn't hold. The sheer number of infant remains, the age distribution, and the ritual context all pointed to one conclusion. These children had been sacrificed. Studies of the bone remains show that many of these children were healthy at the time of death. They didn't die from disease or malnutrition. Analysis of the cremation patterns indicates that at least some of these children were alive when placed in the fire. The temperatures required to produce the cremation patterns found can only be achieved with living or very freshly dead bodies. Inscriptions found at the Tophet sites include dedicatory phrases like MLK, which scholars now understand as indicating a specific type of votive offering. These aren't burials. They're thank offerings made to fulfill vows or to request divine favor. The practice continued for centuries. The Tophet at Carthage was in use from approximately 800 BCE until the Romans destroyed the city in 146 BCE. During that time, tens of thousands of children were sacrificed. Some estimates run higher, into the hundreds of thousands, though exact numbers are impossible to determine. So what did the actual ritual look like? We can reconstruct it from multiple sources. Biblical descriptions, accounts by Greek and Roman historians like Diodorus Siculus and Plutarch, and the archaeological evidence itself. The statue of Moloch was enormous, made of bronze or brass, hollow inside. It depicted the god with the head of a bull, a common, ancient, Near Eastern divine symbol, and the body of a man. The statue's arms extended outward, with hands upturned or forming a platform. The ritual required music, lots of it. Drums, cymbals, trumpets, and flutes played at maximum volume. The ancient sources are specific about this. The music was meant to drown out the screams. Parents weren't supposed to show grief. To cry or mourn was to insult the god and potentially invalidate the sacrifice. The child, often an infant, but sometimes older, was brought forward. In many cases, the child was the offspring of the wealthy or even nobility. This wasn't about disposing of unwanted children. This was the sacrifice of precious, valued children. That was precisely what made it valuable to the god. Some accounts suggest the children were killed before being placed in the fire, perhaps as a mercy. But other accounts, particularly from eyewitnesses describing the practices at Carthage, indicate that children were placed alive on the heated arms of the statue or directly into the fire below. The physics of what happened next are straightforward and horrifying. The intense heat would cause the child's body to contract. The limbs would draw up. In the case of infants placed on the heated arms, the muscle contractions would cause the small body to roll, falling into the furnace below. Ancient sources describe this motion, and their word choice is telling. They said it looked like the child was being embraced by the god, drawn into Moloch's fiery lap. The entire community participated as witnesses. This wasn't hidden or secretive. It was a public ritual, often performed during times of crisis, military threat, drought, plague. The sacrifice was meant to appease the god and secure his favor for the entire community. Parents who offered their children were honored. They had proven their devotion beyond question. They had given their most precious possession to the god. In Carthaginian society, this brought status and demonstrated piety. Let me be direct about how disturbing this is. We're talking about cultures where mothers and fathers willingly brought their infants to be burned alive, where grandparents watched their grandchildren scream and die, where entire cities participated in the systematic murder of children and called it holy. The question that haunts anyone who studies this practice is how? How could human beings do this? How could parents sacrifice their own children? How could a civilization sustain this practice for centuries? The answer lies in understanding how these ancient peoples conceived of the relationship between humans and gods. They didn't have our modern conception of a loving, benevolent deity. Their gods were powerful, dangerous forces that needed to be appeased. The gods controlled whether crops grew, whether rain fell, whether enemies were defeated. To fail to satisfy the gods meant death for everyone. Child sacrifice represented the ultimate offering because it involved giving up the future itself. Your child was your immortality, your legacy, the continuation of your family line. To sacrifice that child was to sacrifice everything you hoped for. That's what made it valuable to the gods. There was also a magical logic at work. In ancient Near Eastern thought, children represented pure potential, uncorrupted life force. That potency could be transferred to the god, feeding divine power. The more innocent and valuable the victim, the more powerful the offering. A firstborn child from a noble family carried more magical weight than a slave or a pauper's child. The practice also served social functions, though these were probably unconscious. Child sacrifice created intense social bonds. If everyone in your community has participated in or witnessed these rituals, if everyone carries the same terrible secret, that shared trauma binds you together. It's a perverse form of social cohesion, but effective nonetheless. The Hebrew Bible's repeated condemnations of child sacrifice tell us something important. Ancient Israelites were tempted by this practice. The prophets wouldn't have needed to condemn it so frequently and so vehemently if it weren't a genuine issue. Archaeological evidence suggests that even in Israel and Judah, some people engaged in child sacrifice, particularly during periods when Canaanite religious practices infiltrated Hebrew worship. The practice declined as new religious and philosophical ideas spread. The Greek and Roman sources describe Moloch worship with horror because by their time, civilized opinion had turned against such practices. When Rome finally destroyed Carthage in 146 BCE, they ritually cursed the ground, plowing salt into the earth. They wanted to erase this civilization that had horrified them with its practices. But we should acknowledge that Rome, even as it condemned Carthage, had its own brutal rituals. Gladiatorial games sacrificed human lives for entertainment. The conquest of Carthage involved the massacre of survivors and the enslavement of the population. The Romans didn't reject brutality. They rejected this particular form of ritual brutality. From an esoteric perspective, what's significant about Moloch worship is the magical theory of sacrifice taken to its absolute extreme. The principle is simple. To receive power, you must give something of value. The more valuable the offering, the greater the power granted. Child sacrifice represents this logic pushed to its ultimate conclusion. This same magical principle appears in attenuated form across many religious traditions. Christians speak of God sacrificing his only son. Abraham is praised for being willing to sacrifice Isaac. Hinduism has stories of kings offering their sons to the gods. The difference is that in most traditions, these are stories, metaphors, or tests of faith that don't require completion. With Moloch, it was literal and routine. The brutality of these practices leaves us with uncomfortable questions. If entire civilizations could normalize the murder of children through religious ritual, what does that say about the human capacity for evil cloaked in spiritual language? How do we distinguish between authentic spiritual practice and barbarism, dressed up as religion? Perhaps the most disturbing aspect is that the practitioners didn't see themselves as evil. They saw themselves as pious, as making the hardest sacrifice possible to protect their families and communities. They believed they were sustaining cosmic order, satisfying divine requirements, and securing prosperity. From Moloch worship in the ancient Mediterranean, we travel across the ocean and forward in time to another civilization that made human sacrifice central to its religion and worldview, the Aztec Empire of Mesoamerica. But while Moloch worship shocked the ancient world, the Aztec sacrificial system operated on a scale that dwarfed anything the Carthaginians ever did. We're talking about an entire civilization organized around the principle that human blood and hearts were necessary to sustain the universe itself. The Aztecs believed something that most religions don't. They believed that the gods needed humans as much as humans needed the gods. More specifically, they believed that the sun god Huitzilopochtli required constant nourishment in the form of human hearts and blood, or he would fail in his daily battle against darkness and the world would end. This wasn't metaphor. This wasn't symbolic. The Aztecs literally believed that their sacrificial rituals kept the sun moving across the sky and prevented the apocalypse every single day. Let me establish the scale first, because it's staggering. Modern historians working from both Spanish colonial records and Aztec codices estimate that the Aztec Empire sacrificed between 20,000 and 250,000 people per year at its height. The range is wide because records are incomplete and Spanish sources may have exaggerated, but even the conservative estimate means that every single day, dozens of people were killed in ritual sacrifice across the empire. The most famous event was the dedication of the renovated Templo Mayor in Tenochtitlan in 1487. Spanish chroniclers recording Aztec oral histories, claimed that 80,400 prisoners were sacrificed over 4 days. Modern historians debate this number. Some think it's exaggerated, others accept it. Even if we quarter that number, we're talking about 20,000 human beings killed in 4 days of continuous ritual. Think about the logistics alone. 4 days means 96 hours. If 20,000 people were killed, that's over 200 people per hour, more than 3 people per minute, around the clock. Multiple sacrificial platforms would have been operating simultaneously. The steps of the pyramid would have been rivers of blood. The smell would have been overwhelming. The psychological impact on witnesses, which included much of the city's population, must have been immense. So let's talk about the actual ritual, because the details matter for understanding what this civilization considered sacred duty. The Templo Mayor, the Great Pyramid at the heart of Tenochtitlan, had 2 temples at its summit, one dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, the sun god and war god, and one to Tlaloc, the rain god. Steep stairs, intentionally difficult to climb, led to these temples. Prisoners of war, the primary sacrifice victims, were brought to the base of the pyramid. They had been captured specifically for this purpose. Aztec warfare wasn't primarily about killing enemies on the battlefield. It was about capturing them alive for sacrifice. Warriors who captured many prisoners gained status and honor. The prisoners, often dressed in ritual costumes and adorned to represent specific gods, were led up the pyramid steps. This ascent had symbolic meaning. They were climbing toward the sun, toward the heavens. Some prisoners were drugged with psychoactive substances to keep them compliant. Others went willingly, having been convinced through captivity that this death was honorable. At the top, 4 priests seized the victim. These priests, called Tlenomacake, wore black robes encrusted with dried blood. Their hair was long, matted, and unwashed. It too was stiffened with the blood of previous sacrifices. They lived in the temple precinct and performed sacrifices daily. Their entire lives revolved around ritual killing. The victim was bent backward over the tek cattle, the sacrificial stone. This stone was carved to curve the chest upward and outward, presenting the heart for the blade. The 4 priests held the victim's limbs. The 5th priest, the one who performed the actual sacrifice, used a tekpatl, a ritual knife made from obsidian or flint. Obsidian can be worked to an edge sharper than modern surgical steel. In practiced hands, it's an efficient tool for cutting. The priest knew the precise location to cut. He made an incision below the sternum, cutting through muscle and cartilage. He reached into the chest cavity, still pulsing with life, and grasped the heart. With a twisting motion, he severed the major vessels and pulled the heart free. The victim was still alive for this. Death came seconds later, but there was a moment, brief but real, when the victim felt their heart being removed. Ancient sources are clear about this. The heart had to be still beating when offered to the gods. The priest held the heart aloft, offering it to the sun. Blood ran down his arms. The heart continued to beat in his hand for several seconds. Then he placed it in a ceremonial vessel called a quoxicali, or eagle vessel, which accumulated the hearts until they could be ritually burned or buried. The body wasn't done yet. The corpse was pushed down the pyramid steps, tumbling end over end, leaving a trail of blood. At the bottom, it was retrieved and butchered. This is where we need to confront an uncomfortable truth. The Aztecs practiced ritual cannibalism. Not all of the body was consumed, and not by everyone. The warrior who had captured the victim received the corpse and was expected to host a feast where the flesh was consumed by family and friends. The prisoner's captor himself did not eat the flesh. It would be like eating his own flesh, since captor and captive were ritually identified with each other. The cannibalism wasn't about nutrition or hunger, though some scholars have argued protein scarcity played a role. It was spiritual. By consuming the flesh of the sacrifice victim, who had been identified with a god during the ritual, the participants were ingesting divine essence. It was a form of communion, not fundamentally different in concept from Christian Eucharist, though infinitely more literal. The skull was cleaned and added to the zompantli, the massive skull rack that stood in the plaza before the Templo Mayor. When the Spanish conquistadors first saw these racks, they counted thousands of skulls displayed in neat rows. Archaeological excavations have confirmed their accounts. But heart extraction wasn't the only form of Aztec human sacrifice. The civilization had developed dozens of variations, each associated with specific gods and purposes. For Zyptotec, the flayed god associated with agriculture and renewal, the ritual was particularly brutal. Victims were tied to a frame and shot with arrows until they bled to death. Then their skin was completely flayed off. Priests would thereafter, both justified more sacrifice. From a magical perspective, the Aztec system represents the principle of sympathetic exchange taken to its logical extreme. Life for life, blood for rain, hearts for the sun's motion. The cosmos is a machine that requires fuel, and that fuel is life force extracted from living beings. But there's something else here too, something psychological. Anthropologists have noted that the Aztec Empire was relatively young and expanding rapidly. They were a militaristic people surrounded by enemies. The sacrificial system served political purposes. It terrorized enemies, disposed of prisoners who might rebel, and created a shared ritual framework that bound the empire together. When the Spanish arrived in 1519, they were horrified by what they found. Hernán Cortés and his men described the temples encrusted with dried blood, the skull racks, the smell of death that hung over Aztec cities. They used this horror to justify their conquest and forced conversion of the population. But we should note the hypocrisy. The Spanish Inquisition was in full operation at this same time, torturing and burning heretics. The conquistadors themselves massacred thousands of indigenous people. They destroyed an entire civilization and replaced it with their own brutal colonial system. The difference wasn't really in the brutality, it was in the framing. The Aztecs were honest about what they were doing and why. They killed people ritually to sustain the cosmos. The Spanish killed people to save their souls and to extract gold, but they dressed it up in the language of civilization and salvation. The Aztec sacrificial system finally ended with the Spanish conquest. Not because the conquerors were more civilized, but because they had better weapons and brought diseases that killed 90% of the indigenous population. The temples were torn down, the codices mostly burned, the priests killed or converted, but the memory remains encoded in archaeological sites, surviving codices, and the traumatic history that still shapes Mexican culture today. The Aztec system shows us how an entire civilization can normalize mass killing through religious justification. It shows us how humans can commit atrocities daily and call it sacred duty. It shows us that brutality, when given religious meaning and cosmic importance, can become not just acceptable, but mandatory. Now we need to talk about something that most people don't consider a magical ritual at all, but which, when examined closely, reveals itself as perhaps the most extensive and systematically brutal ritual system in Western history: the procedures of the Holy Inquisition. When we think of the Inquisition, and there were actually several, the Medieval Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition, the Roman Inquisition, we typically think of it as legal prosecution of heretics, religious law enforcement. But this framing misses something crucial. Inquisitorial procedures weren't just legal processes. They were elaborate rituals of spiritual purification that followed liturgical patterns, incorporated sacred symbolism, and treated torture and execution as sacramental acts. The dark irony that we need to confront immediately is this: the very institution created to hunt down and destroy practitioners of dark magic became itself a massive machine for performing ritualized brutality on a scale that dwarfed anything the accused witches were supposedly doing. The hunters became the practitioners of the darkest arts. Let me walk you through the actual procedures of an inquisitorial trial, because the details reveal the ritual structure hidden beneath the legal framework. Everything began with denunciation. Someone would accuse you of heresy, witchcraft, or deviation from church doctrine. You wouldn't necessarily know who accused you. The Inquisition protected its informants, which meant anyone with a grudge could destroy you through anonymous accusation. Once accused, you were arrested and brought to the inquisitorial prison. These weren't normal prisons. They were spaces specifically designed to break the spirit before the body. Dark, damp, isolated cells where you waited, sometimes for months, before your interrogation began. The waiting was part of the process. Fear and uncertainty were the first tools of spiritual correction. When your interrogation finally began, it followed a ritualized pattern. The chamber wasn't just a room, it was a sacred space. Religious imagery covered the walls, crucifixes, paintings of saints, biblical verses. The message was clear. What happened here was holy work. The inquisitors weren't merely interrogators. They were priests, often highly educated theologians, conducting what they understood as spiritual diagnosis. They wore their clerical robes. They began sessions with prayers. They invoked divine authority. They positioned themselves as spiritual physicians treating the disease of heresy. The questions followed a script, a liturgy of interrogation developed over centuries. They asked about your beliefs, your practices, your associates. They paid special attention to any deviation from orthodox doctrine, any hint of magical practice, any suggestion of demonic influence. If you confessed immediately, you might receive relatively light punishment, public penance, fines, imprisonment. But most people didn't confess immediately, either because they were innocent or because they knew confession meant condemnation. And this is where the Inquisition revealed its true nature as a ritual system. Torture wasn't punishment in inquisitorial procedure. It was a sacramental tool for extracting truth. The theological logic was impeccable. Heresy was a poison in the soul. Confession was the only cure. If the accused wouldn't confess voluntarily, torture became a spiritual medicine, painful but necessary for salvation. The torture itself followed elaborate protocols. It wasn't random violence, it was carefully calibrated, religiously sanctioned, ritually structured suffering. Let me describe the most common methods, because their symbolic dimensions are crucial. The strappado involved tying the victim's hands behind their back, attaching the rope to a pulley, and hoisting them off the ground. The victim's own body weight dislocated their shoulders. Sometimes weights were added to increase the pain. Sometimes the victim was dropped suddenly, causing additional joint damage. But before this physical torture began, there were prayers. The inquisitors would ask God to guide them in extracting the truth. They would invoke saints. They would remind the victim that this suffering was for their own spiritual good. The torture chamber became a chapel. The torturer, a priest, administering painful sacraments. The rack stretched the victim's body, pulling limbs from their sockets. As bones cracked and tendons tore, the inquisitors would continue their questions, mixing demands for confession with prayers for the victim's soul. The message was consistent. This pain is purification. Confess and be cleansed. Water torture involved forcing water into the victim's mouth and nose until they experienced the sensation of drowning. Between applications, while the victim choked and gasped, the inquisitors would speak of spiritual cleansing, of washing away sin, of baptismal purification through water. The symbolism was deliberate. The most revealing aspect of inquisitorial torture was its documentation. Everything was written down. Scribes recorded the questions asked, the answers given, the methods used, the victim's screams and pleas. These weren't merely legal records, they were ritual texts, documentation of a liturgical process. When torture finally extracted a confession, and it almost always did, because humans will say anything to stop unbearable pain, the process moved to its next phase, the auto da fe, literally act of faith. The auto da fe was public theatre, but it was religious theatre. It followed a specific ritual sequence that deliberately mirrored Catholic Mass. The condemned were dressed in special garments called sanbenitos. These weren't normal clothes, they were ritual costumes covered in painted flames, demons, and crosses. The imagery marked the wearer as spiritually contaminated, as someone whose soul was literally aflame with heresy. A procession would form. The condemned, wearing their sanbenitos, would be marched through the city streets. Monks and priests walked alongside, carrying crosses and relics. Hymns were sung, prayers were recited. The public was required to witness, to participate in this communal ritual of purification. The procession led to a plaza, where a platform had been erected. The condemned were placed on display. Then came sermons, sometimes lasting hours, explaining their heresies and the necessity of their punishment. These sermons followed homiletic structure. They included biblical citations, theological arguments, moral lessons for the watching crowd. After the sermons came the sentencing. If you had confessed and shown repentance, you might be strangled before burning, a mercy that ensured you were dead before the flames consumed your body. If you remained unrepentant, you would be burned alive. The execution itself was framed as purification. Fire, in Christian symbolism, cleanses. It separates the pure from the impure. It transforms matter into spirit. The Inquisitors genuinely believed, or claimed to believe, that burning heretics was an act of spiritual mercy. Better to destroy the corrupted body and give the soul a chance at posthumous salvation than to let heresy spread. But there's a level of symbolism here that goes even deeper. The auto da fe mirrored the Mass in specific ways that reveal its ritual nature. The procession paralleled the entrance procession of Mass. The sermons replaced the liturgy of the Word. The condemnation of heretics paralleled the consecration, where bread and wine become body and blood. The execution paralleled the consumption of the Eucharist, where the divine consumes the offering. In this perverted liturgy, the heretic became the sacrifice, the offering whose destruction supposedly pleased God and protected the community from spiritual contamination. The scale of the Inquisition varied by time and place. The Spanish Inquisition, the most infamous, operated from 1478 to 1834, over 3.5 centuries. Estimates of the death toll range from 3,000 to 300,000, depending on whether you count only executions or include those who died in prison or from torture. But the numbers don't capture the psychological and spiritual impact. The Inquisition created a culture of terror that lasted for generations. People informed on neighbors, friends, family. Trust disintegrated. Intellectual inquiry became dangerous. Anyone who questioned doctrine, who practiced folk magic, who held unorthodox beliefs, risked denunciation. Entire categories of people lived in constant danger. Jews who had converted to Christianity but were suspected of secretly maintaining Jewish practices. Muslims who had converted but were suspected of continuing Islamic worship. Women who knew herbal medicine and were accused of witchcraft. Mystics whose spiritual experiences didn't match orthodox teachings. The Inquisition also targeted groups wholesale. The Cathars, a Gnostic Christian sect in southern France, were virtually exterminated in a campaign that included both military crusade and systematic inquisitorial persecution. The Knights Templar, accused of heresy and secret rituals, were tortured into confessing to worshipping demons and engaging in obscene rites. Thousands of supposed witches, mostly women, were interrogated, tortured, and executed based on confessions extracted through unbearable pain. Here's the deep irony, the dark truth that we must confront. The Inquisition accused people of performing dark magic, of consorting with demons, of engaging in brutal rituals, and yet the Inquisition itself performed systematic ritual brutality on a scale that dwarfed anything the accused were supposedly doing. Accused witches supposedly flew to midnight sabbats where they worshipped Satan. The Inquisition performed actual public rituals where they tortured and burned people alive while invoking God's name. Accused heretics supposedly engaged in obscene rites. The Inquisition developed elaborate torture protocols that destroyed bodies while claiming to save souls. Accused sorcerers supposedly called demons. The Inquisition created a machinery of suffering that, if demons exist, must have delighted them. The psychological mechanisms here are fascinating and terrifying. The Inquisitors genuinely believed they were doing holy work. They saw themselves as spiritual warriors fighting cosmic evil. They understood torture as medicine and execution as purification. They slept soundly after days spent breaking bodies and burning people alive because they had religious authority, legal sanction, and the conviction that they served God. This reveals something crucial about human nature and ritual practice. We are capable of normalizing any level of brutality if we embed it in the right framework of meaning. Give us religious authority, create the right rituals, develop the proper liturgies, and we can transform torture into sacrament and murder into holy work. The Inquisition also reveals the dangerous relationship between Orthodox religion and magic. The Inquisitors condemned magic as demonic, as trafficking with evil spirits, as rebellion against God. But their own procedures were deeply magical in structure and intent. They used ritual objects, the cross, holy water, sacred texts. They invoked supernatural powers, God, saints, angels. They performed ritualized actions, prayers, interrogations, torture sequences, executions. They believed these actions had spiritual efficacy. They purified souls, protected communities, defeated demons. The difference between an inquisitor performing an auto da fe and a ritual magician performing a ceremony is not in the structure or the magical thinking. It's in the social sanction. The inquisitor had the church's blessing, the magician didn't. From an esoteric perspective, what the Inquisition performed was sympathetic magic on a massive scale, burning the body to purify the soul, inflicting pain to extract truth, destroying heretics to protect orthodoxy. These are magical correspondences, as above, so below, as in the physical realm, so in the spiritual. The Inquisition finally ended in the 19th century, not because the Church suddenly decided torture was wrong, but because secular authorities stripped the Church of the power to prosecute heresy. The rituals stopped when the social and legal framework that supported them collapsed. But the legacy remains. The Inquisition shaped Western culture's relationship with spirituality, magic, and persecution. It established patterns of thought control and conformity enforcement that secular authorities later adapted. It demonstrated how easily religious authority can become religious tyranny. The brutal irony is that the Inquisition, created to fight darkness, became one of history's darkest chapters. The hunters of demons became demons themselves. The prosecutors of dark magic became the practitioners of the darkest arts. And they did it all while invoking God's name, performing elaborate rituals, and believing themselves righteous. This is perhaps the most important lesson the Inquisition teaches us. When we give ourselves permission to harm others in the name of spiritual purity, when we transform cruelty into ritual and call it holy, when we become so convinced of our righteousness that we stop seeing the humanity of those we harm, that's when we become the very evil we claim to fight. We've covered ancient and medieval practices, But now we need to talk about something modern, something that took the dark currents of Western occultism and weaponized them into perhaps the most dangerous magical order of the 20th and 21st centuries, the Order of Nine Angles. This organization represents something fundamentally different from theatrical Satanism or philosophical left-hand path practice. This isn't Anton LaVey's Church of Satan with its Ayn Rand-influenced individualism and symbolic Satan. This isn't even Aleister Crowley's Thelema with its do what thou wilt philosophy. What we're dealing with here is something darker, more violent, and explicitly dangerous in ways that other occult organizations aren't. Founded in Britain in the 1960s, though some claim earlier origins, the group presents itself as a traditional satanic organization preserving ancient, sinister teachings. In reality, it's a relatively modern creation that synthesized elements from Crowley's work, Nazi occultism, social Darwinism, extreme left-hand path philosophy, and its founder's own twisted vision into something genuinely malevolent. The founder, using the pseudonym Anton Long, later revealed to be David Myatt, though he denies this, created a system that goes far beyond typical occultism. This is teaching that violence, cruelty, and the violation of all social norms are necessary steps on the path to creating a new type of human, the satanic Superman who has transcended conventional morality entirely. Let me explain the actual system, because understanding it is crucial to grasping why law enforcement agencies in multiple countries monitor this group as a terrorist-adjacent ideology. The teachings include what's called the Sevenfold Sinister Way, a system of advancement through 7 stages or grades. But unlike most magical orders, where advancement comes through study, meditation, and ritual practice, this path requires what they call practical deeds, acts of real-world transgression and violence. The early stages involve relatively standard occult practices: meditation, ritual magic, study of esoteric texts. But as practitioners advance, the requirements become darker. The literature explicitly advocates that serious practitioners should infiltrate political organizations. They specifically mention both far-right and far-left groups, subvert mainstream religions, commit acts of physical violence, and engage in what they euphemistically call culling, the removal of individuals deemed weak or unworthy. The magical system includes rituals designed to invoke what they call dark gods, or acausal entities, beings from dimensions beyond normal space-time who represent forces of chaos, destruction, and transformation. Their cosmology includes entities like Baphomet, Satan, and several beings from their own unique pantheon. One of their central rituals is called the Ceremony of Recalling. This rite supposedly opens gates between our dimension and the acausal realms, allowing these dark entities to influence our world. The ritual requires specific alignments of planets, elaborate preparations, and according to some texts, works best when performed at sites of recent violence or death. But the truly disturbing aspect isn't the magical theory, it's the practical application. The teaching explicitly states that magic without action is worthless. They advocate what they call presencing the dark, making abstract dark forces manifest in the real world through actual deeds. This isn't metaphor. Their literature explicitly discusses human sacrifice. The texts describe it as the ultimate act of magic, the supreme violation of societal norms that demonstrates the practitioner has transcended human weakness. They frame it as a culling, removing the weak to strengthen the species, but the end result is the same: ritual murder presented as spiritual practice. Several documented cases have connected individuals to this organization who later committed serious crimes. In the UK, members have been convicted of terrorism-related offenses. In the US, individuals connected to the group have been linked to violent plots. The organization attracts precisely the kind of people who shouldn't be given philosophical justification for their violent impulses. Sociopaths looking for a framework that validates their desires to harm others. The system also developed what they call insight roles, extended practices where members infiltrate organizations or adopt personas for years at a time to gain understanding and influence. They explicitly advocate joining extremist political groups, law enforcement, military organizations, or religious institutions. The goal is both personal development through experiencing different perspectives and systemic subversion from within. This makes the group particularly insidious. Unlike traditional occult organizations that are relatively transparent about their membership and practices, this operates entirely through cells and individuals. There's no central membership list, no official hierarchy that can be monitored, no public meetings. Members may never meet each other. They receive teachings through published texts and operate independently, making law enforcement intervention extremely difficult. The ideology combines occultism with elements of extreme social Darwinism and what they call aeonic magic. Magic designed to change entire civilizations over centuries. They advocate for the collapse of what they call Magian civilization, Judeo-Christian culture, and its replacement with a new, sinister aeon. This requires, according to their teachings, systematic subversion, violence, and the creation of chaos that will allow new forms of society to emerge. The influence has spread far beyond its small core membership. The texts circulate in far-right extremist circles, neo-Nazi forums, and violent accelerationist networks. The organization provides a thin occult veneer over violent ideologies, allowing people who want to commit atrocities to frame their desires as spiritual practice. What makes this especially dangerous is the sophisticated philosophical framework. The group doesn't present itself as a gang of thugs. It presents itself as an elite esoteric order, preserving ancient wisdom. It uses complex language, elaborate cosmologies, and deep magical theory. For alienated individuals seeking meaning, especially those with violent inclinations or radical political views, this combination of intellectual sophistication and transgressive content is seductive. This represents a perversion of legitimate left-hand path philosophy. Traditional left-hand path teachings do advocate transcending conventional morality, but through understanding and wisdom, not through violence. The Agoras violate taboos within a rigorous philosophical framework aimed at liberation and compassion. This system advocates violence within a framework aimed at domination and destruction. The difference is crucial. Authentic esoteric traditions, even challenging ones, include ethical development as part of spiritual advancement. They teach that transcending conventional morality means acting from deeper wisdom, not acting without restraint. What we're examining here removed all ethical constraints and called it spiritual evolution. Law enforcement and counter-terrorism agencies have struggled with how to address this. In some countries, simply being a member isn't illegal. Freedom of religion and association protect even repugnant beliefs. But when those beliefs explicitly advocate violence and several members have committed serious crimes, the line between protected speech and terrorist ideology becomes blurred. The texts are carefully written to maintain plausible deniability. When they discuss culling, they can claim it's metaphorical. When they discuss human sacrifice, they can argue it's historical or theoretical. But private communications seized from arrested members often reveal more explicit intentions. The philosophy also weaponizes occultism's appeal to rebellious youth, teenagers and young adults searching for identity, alienated from mainstream society, attracted to transgression and darkness. These are precisely the demographics being targeted. The literature is deliberately designed to appeal to intelligent but disaffected young people, offering them a sense of elite knowledge and superiority over the mundane masses. From a purely magical perspective, setting aside the violence and criminality, the ritual system is actually relatively sophisticated. It draws from genuine occult traditions, thelema, chaos magic, traditional Satanism, Norse paganism, and others. If the same magical theory were divorced from the advocacy of violence, it would be just another left-hand path organization. But it can't be divorced from that advocacy because violence is central to the system. The teaching states explicitly that magic without real-world action is worthless, and the actions they advocate are specifically chosen to be violent, transgressive, and harmful. The magic and the violence are inseparable. This reveals something important about occultism's dark side. Magical systems are tools. They can be used for self-understanding, spiritual development, and positive transformation. But they can also be used to reinforce pathological thinking, justify cruelty, and provide sophisticated rationalizations for evil acts. What we see here is what happens when you take occult philosophy's most dangerous elements: the rejection of conventional morality, the embrace of darkness, the pursuit of power, the idea that the strong should dominate the weak, and remove all ethical constraints. You get a system that transforms sociopathy into spiritual practice and calls murder mysticism. For researchers of esotericism, this presents difficult questions. How do we study dangerous magical systems without amplifying them? How do we distinguish between authentic, if challenging, spiritual paths and ideologies that simply use occult language to justify violence? How do we protect freedom of belief while addressing organizations whose beliefs explicitly advocate harm? There are no easy answers. But what's clear is that this represents modern occultism's most dangerous expression. It's not the largest satanic organization, not the most influential, not the oldest, but it may be the most genuinely malevolent, the one that most clearly crosses the line from spiritual practice into criminal ideology. The brutal legacy includes violence, murder, and the corruption of occult philosophy in service of harm. It stands as a warning that not all spiritual paths lead toward enlightenment. Some lead directly into darkness, and not the productive darkness of shadow work and psychological integration, but the destructive darkness of violence, hatred, and death. We began this video with Aleister Crowley and the Abramelin operation. It's fitting that we return to Crowley now to examine what he himself described as his most dangerous ritual: the invocation of Choronzon, the demon of dispersion, in the Algerian desert in 1909. This ritual represents something different from the other practices we've discussed. It's not about physical brutality. No one was tortured or killed. It's not about transgressing social taboos or sacrificing to gods. The brutality of the Choronzon invocation is entirely psychological and spiritual. It's a deliberate attempt to destroy your own sense of identity, to confront the demon that represents ego dissolution and psychological chaos. To understand this ritual, we need to understand Enochian magic and the cosmology Crowley was working within. Enochian magic is a system allegedly revealed to the Elizabethan magicians John Dee and Edward Kelly by angels in the 1580s. It involves an elaborate language, complex tables of letters and numbers, and a cosmology of 30 ethers, or spiritual dimensions, that surround and interpenetrate the physical world. The ethers are numbered from 30, closest to physical reality, to 1, closest to divine source. As you ascend through them, you encounter increasingly powerful and incomprehensible spiritual forces. Between the 10th ether and the abyss that leads to the higher ethers dwells Choronzon, described as the first and deadliest of all the demons. Choronzon isn't a demon in the medieval Christian sense. It doesn't simply tempt you to sin or try to drag your soul to hell. Choronzon represents something far more fundamental: the principle of dispersion, fragmentation, and the dissolution of all coherent form. It embodies multiplicity without unity, parts without whole, noise without signal. In Crowley's thelemic system, which he developed based on his magical experiences, Choronzon represents the final obstacle before achieving the grade of Master of the Temple. To cross the abyss and attain this grade, the magician must surrender absolutely everything: all sense of individual identity, all attachment to ego, all coherent selfhood. You must become nothing before you can become everything. But here's the terrifying part. Choronzon exists specifically to prevent this crossing. It attacks your sense of self, attempts to fragment your consciousness, and tries to drive you into madness. Confronting Choronzon means deliberately exposing yourself to forces designed to destroy your psychological coherence. In December 1909, Crowley and his assistant, Victor Newberg, traveled to the Algerian desert outside Bou Saada. They chose a remote location deliberately. What they were about to attempt required absolute isolation from civilization. Following the procedures outlined in Enochian magical texts, they prepared a circle of protection. Unlike the elaborate temple spaces used in most ceremonial magic, this was drawn in sand. The circle wasn't large, perhaps 9 or 10 feet in diameter. Inside, they placed a triangle, pointing outward. This triangle would be where Choronzon would manifest. The magical theory was specific. Newberg would sit inside the circle, protected by names of God and magical seals. Crowley would stand in the triangle, deliberately placing himself outside the protection, and would invoke Choronzon to appear. But there was a twist. Crowley wouldn't remain as himself during the invocation. He would practice what occultists call assumption of God form, deliberately inviting Choronzon to possess his body. He would become the demon, allowing it to speak through him, act through him, and potentially destroy him from within. Newberg's role was to record everything that happened and to maintain the integrity of the circle no matter what. Under no circumstances was he to break the circle or leave its protection, because if he did, there would be no anchor to physical reality, no protection for either of them from Choronzon's dissolving influence. The ritual began with prayers and invocations from the Enochian system. Crowley called upon the ethers in sequence, opening each one in turn. As he reached the abyss, he began the specific invocations to summon Choronzon. According to Newberg's detailed account, what happened next was absolutely terrifying. Crowley's entire demeanor changed. His voice shifted, becoming multiple voices overlapping. His movements became erratic and inhuman. He had invited the demon into himself, and it had accepted. Choronzon, speaking through Crowley, immediately began attacking Newberg psychologically. It argued, cajoled, and threatened. It took multiple forms, shifting between appearing as Crowley, as a beautiful woman, as an old man, as abstract geometric patterns. It attempted every method possible to trick Newberg into breaking the circle. The demon claimed the circle was unnecessary, that Newberg was being paranoid. It claimed that Crowley was in danger and needed help, appealing to Newberg's loyalty and friendship. It threatened violence if Newberg didn't comply. It promised rewards and knowledge if he would just step outside. Newberg, to his credit, maintained the circle. He used prayers, divine names, and his own willpower to resist every psychological attack. but the ordeal lasted for hours, and as it progressed, the attacks became more sophisticated and more disturbing. At one point, according to Neuberg's account, Choronzon physically attacked. It grabbed sand and threw it in Neuberg's face, attempting to blind him and break his concentration. It attempted to physically cross into the circle. Neuberg reported feeling the air itself becoming hostile, pressing in on him, making it difficult to breathe. The experience of sitting in that circle, watching your friend and teacher become possessed by something inhuman. Hearing your own fears and doubts spoken back to you in twisted form, feeling psychological and spiritual forces attempting to shatter your sanity. This is the brutal core of the Choronzon invocation. For Crowley, the experience was even more intense. He had invited this force into himself. He had become, temporarily, the demon of dispersion. Every coherent thought fragmented, every sense of identity dissolved. He experienced directly what Buddhists call no self, and what psychologists might call complete ego dissolution, but in the most terrifying possible context. The ritual finally ended when Neuberg performed a banishing, using divine names and commands to drive Choronzon back and seal the abyss. Crowley collapsed, returning to normal consciousness, but profoundly shaken by what he had experienced. Both men reported that the aftermath was severe. Crowley experienced what he called a dark night of the soul that lasted for months. He questioned everything about his magical work, his life's purpose, his sanity itself. The experience had shown him directly what lay on the other side of ego, not enlightenment, but dissolution, not transcendence, but fragmentation. Neuberg never fully recovered from witnessing the ritual. He later suffered psychological problems and distanced himself from Crowley's magical work. Seeing your teacher possessed by a demon of chaos, sitting for hours under psychological assault, maintaining protection through pure willpower while something inhuman attempts to destroy you, this leaves permanent marks on the psyche. The question that haunts anyone who studies this ritual is what actually happened. There are several possible interpretations. From a traditional magical perspective, Crowley and Neuberg did exactly what they intended. They invoked an actual entity, a demon or alien intelligence, and Crowley allowed it to temporarily possess him. The danger was real, the entity was real, and only Neuberg's protection kept them both from permanent harm. From a psychological perspective, what they experienced was a controlled psychotic episode. Crowley deliberately induced a dissociative state, allowed multiple aspects of his psyche to manifest as separate entities, and Neuberg witnessed his friend experience temporary madness while fighting his own suggestibility and fear. From a phenomenological perspective, taking experience seriously without making ontological claims, it doesn't matter whether Choronzon was real or not. The experience was real. The psychological impact was real. The confrontation with ego dissolution and psychological fragmentation was genuine, regardless of whether you attribute it to external demons or internal processes. What makes the Choronzon invocation particularly brutal is that it's a deliberate attempt at spiritual suicide. You're trying to destroy your own sense of self. You're inviting forces, whether external or internal, that will fragment, disperse, and dissolve everything you think you are. Most spiritual paths talk about ego death as something desirable, a step toward enlightenment. But the Choronzon ritual shows you what ego death actually feels like. It feels like madness, like dissolution, like everything you are flying apart into disconnected pieces. It's not peaceful. It's not blissful. It's terrifying. The ritual represents a specific magical philosophy, that you cannot transcend the ego by gently talking it down. You must confront it with its own annihilation. You must look directly into the abyss and let the abyss look back into you. Only by surviving that confrontation can you achieve genuine spiritual transformation. But here's the problem. Not everyone who attempts this survives psychologically intact. The magical literature is full of warnings about the dangers of invoking Choronzon. Crowley himself considered it his most dangerous working. Many magicians who've attempted it report severe psychological crises, identity dissolution, dissociative episodes, or what could be clinically diagnosed as psychotic breaks. The line between successful magical initiation and psychotic breakdown is incredibly thin when you're deliberately trying to fragment your own consciousness. The only difference is whether you successfully reintegrate afterward. This raises profound ethical questions about extreme spiritual practices. Is it ever justified to deliberately induce psychotic-like states in pursuit of spiritual knowledge? How do we distinguish between transformative spiritual crisis and genuine mental illness? What responsibility do teachers have when they guide students into practices that could break them? The Order of the Nine. Angles, which we discussed earlier, provides a dark answer. They don't care. If people break, they were weak. The Choronzon ritual, as Crowley designed it, includes at least some safeguards. The protective circle, the assistant who remains grounded, the careful preparation. But fundamentally, the Choronzon invocation represents magical practice at its most dangerous psychological extreme. You're weaponizing spiritual techniques against your own sense of self. You're deliberately creating conditions for ego dissolution. You're confronting forces that, whether you conceive them as external demons or internal psychological complexes, have the power to permanently damage your psyche. The brutality here is entirely internal. No blood is shed. No physical pain is inflicted, but the psychological and spiritual ordeal rivals anything we've discussed. Sitting in that circle, while something inhuman attempts to destroy your sanity, allowing a force of pure chaos to possess your body and fragment your identity, maintaining coherent consciousness while experiencing the dissolution of everything you use to define yourself, this is perhaps the purest form of spiritual brutality. The Choronzon invocation teaches us that the most dangerous spiritual practices aren't always the ones involving physical danger. Sometimes the greatest risk is to your mind, your identity, your fundamental sense of who you are. And unlike a broken body, which can heal with time, a shattered psyche may never fully recover. Crowley survived the ritual, though he claimed it changed him permanently. He crossed the abyss, at least in his own understanding, and achieved the grade of Master of the Temple. Whether that spiritual attainment was worth the psychological cost, whether the transformation was genuine enlightenment or just reorganization of a damaged psyche, is something each student of occultism must decide for themselves. What's clear is that the invocation of Choronzon represents ceremonial magic's most direct assault on the fortress of ego. It's magic as a psychological warfare waged against yourself. And like all warfare, it leaves casualties. Some emerge transformed, others emerge broken, and some don't emerge at all.